Welcome to APIs You Won't Hate, episode 3. I'm Matt, here as always with my two really good friends, Phil and Mike. Mike, we'll start with you. How's it going?
Heyo, I'm doing all right. I am reporting from my new office and my new home here in Charlotte. So if I seem lightly disheveled or if you hear some weird background noises, it's definitely the poltergeists in my new office.
Perfect. Hopefully they left with the old people and didn't stay around, but you never know.
That's right. Hard to tell. We'll flush them out eventually.
Hopefully. Phil, you're back in America right now, aren't you? Still?
Yes, I came over for API City, went to Seattle to go to that conference. Really good conference, as always. Tessamera did a great job. And then I took a 3-day Amtrak to New York because I'm trying to avoid kicking the planet in the face too hard. That was a whole thing. And yeah, now I'm in New York for a little bit while I wait for my foot to recover.
That's right. You had a foot problem, but I remember you were ranting about it on Twitter. So we're not going to talk about that because I think everyone knows at this point what all is going on. But I mean, I'm curious how like this is totally unrelated to APIs, but it is used, so it works. How was the train ride?
The train ride is actually pretty good. The first train, it went via Chicago, so it was 2 days, and then 1 day with a bit of break in the middle. The first train didn't have any Wi-Fi, so I was just using my personal hotspot a bit. But there is no internet in North Dakota, none. The whole way through it, just nothing. Oil fields and trains, nothing else. And then the train from Chicago to New York had awesome Wi-Fi. It was really quick, so I was just working and resting my foot and watching telly and getting stuff done. I actually wrote a bit of book, so I got the chapter I was talking about on last podcast, surviving other people's APIs. The chapter about architecture. I managed to get that one going.
Nice.
So it was useful to have that time to focus on writing and things.
Yeah, that's cool. I'd like to hear more about the train travels at some point because I haven't. I'd love to do a train traveling across the country, but I know that's a whole lot of work. But so real fast before we really dive into it, there's two things we want to kind of do. Is first off, thank Lorna J. Mitchell for her updates to OpenAPI.tool. She really kind of helped us with kind of the direction of the site, kind of breaking out the topics. That way it's really easy for people to show up and kind of see what the site's about. And then also thanks for Phil for picking up the slack for me not knowing Ruby well enough to fix standards.rest. So we have a new little website out now, standards.rest, if you want to check out any kind of standard around the REST pattern or REST APIs, things like that. We have that up and running now. So Phil, thank you for fixing that.
Yeah, no worries. I got my mate to sort it out. I'm staying here with John Crepesi, who works over at GitHub, and he is the best Ruby developer I've ever known. He was doing some crazy stuff, and I was just typing in whatever he said. I was like, sure, that sounds fine.
Yeah.
Whatever. Yeah, and now it works. So
I think the big thing we want to talk about today is a topic: GraphQL backend for front ends on REST and REST backend for front ends on GraphQL. Phil, I know you have thoughts, especially around using GraphQL on top of REST. So, what is going on with this?
Sure. So part of the architecture chapter I was writing is about the concept of BFFs, which is backend for front end. So when you basically, there's a lot of reason teams do it, and it could be the case that APIs are changing too frequently, so they want to kind of have their own API where they proxy requests through and they can kind of control their own API, but it's much easier to update. So things like when an API maybe goes away, like if it gets turned off or if it changes substantially or they deprecate an entire global version, that can just break your client, and then you have to rush updates out to all your clients. It's not so bad if it's like a web app, and as soon as people refresh the browser, they've got the new client. But and it's not so bad if you have mobile applications that auto update. But for other people, other users, end users, just have a broken experience. So BFFs are a way to give a bit of power to the front end teams, and they just build their own API and change the code whenever they want. A lot of people have been talking about using GraphQL as a BFF on top of REST APIs. There's a bunch of different reasons. I'm not entirely sure I understand them. I'm trying to avoid just complaining about GraphQL. But generally speaking, the idea is that you want to create one consistent interface because all the other APIs might be super different. But as somebody who works in like API design governance, like why are all the APIs super different? If every single API has completely different authentication strategies, like you should probably just replace it with API gateway that has consistent authentication stuff built in, right? So that part of the use case is a bit weird, but yeah, generally it seems like GraphQL kind of strips away a lot of the HTTP-ness of the REST API. If the APIs in the background are all just trash and badly written, then you're not really losing much. That kind of makes sense. But again, why are the APIs all trash? But there's people out here that can help you make good ones. But generally, like all the HTTP caching logic, all of the ability to monitor based on endpoints. So all of that stuff kind of goes away, and you're just shoving stuff over the pipe with no like caching keywords or anything useful. So I've been getting a bit confused trying to work out. I'm trying to write in this chapter why people use GraphQL as a BFF over REST APIs, and I'm just like I don't get it.
Well, I mean that came up at my job where I'm getting ready to write a new API for like a microservice that we have, and another guy suggested that the REST API I'm going to write should interface to a GraphQL endpoint that'll then work its way down to the client. And I was just kind of like, I don't completely understand why we need to have all of these steps going forward when an API gateway just sitting in front of all of our APIs is probably a lot less work, a lot less confusing, and is easier to kind of like onboard new developers to as well.
Yeah, I think an API gateway can help out a lot of that stuff. I mean, if it's about solving consistency issues, then absolutely. Like, you can add authentication at the gateway level and then kind of remove it from those other HTTP APIs. And then you have consistent stuff, and you haven't made every single team need to build their own API just so they can have a consistent experience. Also, things like hypermedia, I actually feel like are a lot more useful in a BFF than in general, right? Because if the hypermedia controls or HTTPs, if hypermedia controls are like next available actions and state, and like what you can do next with this data, I feel like a BFF is a really good place for HTTPs to exist because they have the extra context if they know exactly what that client is up to. So different clients might actually consider different state. Like the data can have a certain state, and like an invoice can be payable or whatever. But then the BFF can take into consideration other information like who the current user is, or I don't know, a bunch of different things, and then figure out which actions to make available. So I feel like a BFF being in REST it is much more useful than necessarily a super generic backend. And yeah, like having GraphQL as a kind of more upstream service can be super handy. REST can wrap random databases and key stores and a bit of CouchDB for some reason, and GraphQL, and why not a few RPC things, but then you smush it all down into this super rigid, well-defined interface that hopefully doesn't change very often, and has like state on it. That just seems like exactly what REST is for.
So Phil, I'm going to ask you to define a couple of things, particularly because from my perspective, I guess I'm not as experienced with using it, but tell me about the case for using an API gateway and when you would decide. It sounds like that's essentially something used for aggregating multiple services together, right?
I gotcha. Yeah. So we worked, for example, when I was there, we had a bunch of different APIs, and it was full on Death Star pattern, where like A and B and C and D, they all just require each other in this big, crazy dependency graph. And every single API was completely different. There was, everyone was implementing authentication with different Ruby gems or with a JavaScript package or in different ways. And caching was being implemented differently, like inside the application instead of at a generic HTTP level. So basically, people were writing out a lot of the same functionality. We wanted to add rate limiting to some APIs, and so people would install another rate limiting gem, and this API would work differently to that API. So API gateways, sometimes the term gets a bit confused, and people start trying to bake like business logic in there, and that really shouldn't be what it's about. It's just a consistent way to add functionality to the outside. And it's a bit similar to a service mesh. There's sometimes a bit of confusion, and the industry has confused itself by there used to be service meshes and API gateways, but then new versions were released where you could use API gateways added service mesh functionality.
Oh man, we love doing that to ourselves, huh?
API functionality, so now both the same thing essentially. But the most simplistic way of kind of characterizing them usually is you have API gateway is the barrier to kind of the public outside internet, and things are coming into your system. And the service mesh is when you're making requests that go out to other services. So a service mesh can still implement authentication. It's just when client makes a request to the service, you're kind of getting in the way of the request as opposed to the outside in stuff.
Sure. So let me repeat some of that back to you just to make sure. From the perspective of someone, let's say I was building something fresh or relatively fresh. I'm working on a project that's getting more complicated. And so by nature, it suddenly has more dependencies on other databases, services, whatever it may be. If I'm building something that suddenly I have to talk to 2 or 3 of my own databases internally from whatever sources that may be, that's when we're talking about an API gateway. Whereas if I'm pulling a bunch of external things, say like the weather and the stock market and whatever else, we're talking about a service mesh. What would you call it when I need both? Do those two?
Yeah, I mean, sure, both is pretty common. I mean, the reason that both systems added both things is because people were using both as both anyway. If you start trying to use an API gateway as a service mesh, then kind of you lose some of the benefits. Like you can use internal DNS, like an internal network references and things like that within a service mesh because they have like service discovery and lookup, so you don't even care what the URLs are. But when you're kind of just doing everything with the API gateway, a lot of people kind of hard code the DNS. It has to kind of go outside and back in again, or you have to do trickery in the network to make it work. So it's a bit of a pain in the butt. But service meshes kind of have that like sidecar approach where you run a process locally on your container, Docker box, whatever, and you just kind of make requests to that, and then it figures out how to talk to the other services. So it's useful.
So more concretely, what are some of the tools used for both of those?
Haven't looked into it in a little while, but Envoy and Istio were 2 pretty popular approaches at the time. I think Envoy is quite low level and you're like mucking about with traffic and kind of doing network level things. And then Istio is kind of the more high level and adds features out of the box like the circuit breaker pattern, which I think we've got a blog post about, and a few other kind of timeouts and retries stuff. It adds those features that you can just enable as opposed to like you have to make those features with Envoy,
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying those things. I wonder how much of our audience is sort of deep into that sort of stuff and like the difference of building an API for yourself and then starting to get really messy and get your feet into these other things starts to get confusing.
Sure.
So I appreciate defining and clarifying those things.
It's one of those things that not a lot of people necessarily play around with. Like if you just build one API, you don't need a gateway necessarily. But as soon as you have like 2 or 3 or 10, then you kind of do. And then once you have like 100 things, then you absolutely need a service mesh. Service mesh. We don't have one at Stoplight because we have like one API and that's it. It's like a JavaScript thing and then a API thing. That's fine. But if we had 3 services, I'd still probably recommend a service mesh right there, just because microservices without a service mesh are disgusting. It's everything falls over and breaks, and there's timeout problems and exponential back off failure. Everything's just a mess.
Yeah. So one of the I'm not going to call it compelling. I don't think it's the right word, but I think one of the reasons that I feel like GraphQL as a BFF is becoming popular is because of things like Gatsby and the Facebook graph typically being used for read-only actions and being particularly user-friendly from a developer experience standpoint, right? Like it's really easy to understand that I'm going to query Facebook's open graph for and this is probably in a past state where Facebook's graph was a lot more open pre a lot of recent political events. But, being able to query your Facebook graph, say, for like all the events that I have and the things I like and all this other stuff, I can understand the read activity of that. And maybe even in that case, caching is less important because you want the most up-to-date thing in some sense. But it's really easy to blur that line of like, that's a great example of how to teach people how graph and relational data, non-relational databases work in that sense. But then it gets really easy to say, well, now we have this thing that we can bludgeon every sort of interface with, or every sort of API with, and we should layer GraphQL on top of that. I think people tend to get there because they've used read-only services that make it easy to do that. I think it becomes really messy when you start talking about creating or deleting or writing to services through GraphQL. But that's also where people started to get into trouble.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, yeah, Gatsby does make that stuff super simple. I've got a bunch of Gatsby running sites and I love them. But yeah, I think there's a big difference between like a Gatsby based website and like a full on single page application that's doing a whole bunch of stuff. And
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's easy to it's also really easy to envision your single page application for whatever purpose as an Apollo, GraphQL, whatever, that's pulling together all of your sources. Because as a developer, maybe even as a young developer, someone building your first sort of project of any depth, it's easy to see that. But you really do start to lose performance, and a lot of the, like you were saying, the restiness of things very quickly, or the HTTP-ness, I suppose, in ways that are like really, really critical to performance and in some sense security too. I wonder if there's a good way to educate people on that, right? To say like, hey, listen, if you're not really deep into understanding how APIs work and how HTTP protocol works, like how do we convey this to you that like really maybe you should take a second and think about this before you go and run and build your next unicorn startup using, only a massive GraphQL approach.
Right. I mean, that's a bunch of really good points. And one of them mentioned like performance. That's actually another topic we want to talk about on this episode. With basically at work, we've noticed we have a GraphQL API at Stoplight, and it's getting kind of tricky to monitor it using the usual kind of APM style, like New Relic. We have New Relic, and New Relic is useless with GraphQL because everything is one endpoint. The whole concept of having these endpoints and transactions, a request comes in, a response goes out, what happened in between those two things, right? Like that whole model doesn't really work when all the requests are going to the same endpoint. And so it just means that instead of you see one endpoint and it's got, a little graph like this, and you see another endpoint and it spikes like that, it just means that everything is kind of average. So you can't figure out nothing. And so as soon as you mention that, everyone says, well, we should just use Apollo. I'm like, okay, but we can use the Apollo platform for monitoring GraphQL stuff, but what about our non-GraphQL stuff? We have two completely different monitoring solutions for the same thing. So I looked into Datadog. They don't really support it. Elastic APM is the one we're probably going to go with because they support. They've had to write specific support for every single Node.js implementation. Every different GraphQL implementation. So there's Express, OpenAPI. I'm getting all mixed up today, but there's Express GraphQL, and then like some other Apollo server GraphQL. And they've had to write code for each one of those implementations to add custom transaction stuff so that you can just use their APM as normal, which is really annoying. But I'm glad that they have done that. I'm sad that they had to, but I'm glad that they've done that because I really want to be able to use the same monitoring solution for everything. So you don't have to worry about lots of user access and teaching people two different systems and everything just being confusing. So I'm glad that we found that.
The bill there is high if you're having to use multiple services to monitor your endpoints as well, right?
Yeah, that stuff gets expensive.
I know from my past job, New Relic is not cheap at all, and I can only imagine that Elastic is probably right up there too. I mean, does it make sense, as someone who doesn't know anything about GraphQL really, I mean, does it make sense to kind of just try and log events deeper into your application and try and monitor it that way as a way, or like just spend the money and get the services going up as quickly as you can?
Yeah, I mean, improving logging is the design document I'm writing right now. So like that would help. We don't really have too much of that right now. And absolutely, like more logging would mean that monitoring is potentially less important. I mean, the expense is kind of an interesting thing because most of the time you're paying per host, per server. So if you have 10 servers and 5 over here and 5 over there, it doesn't really matter too much. It's more about just being bloody annoying. I spent a lot of time at WeWork like teaching people how New Relic works because they just didn't have a clue. And it's really, really good to learn. It's a really powerful tool, but like it takes a lot of work to teach people how this stuff works. Especially some of the little tricks like learning about the error percentile. When you look at the graph, that's like average requests. So you see that graph and it's like, oh yeah, everything looks fine. And you click that percentile icon, you're like, whoa, what's that one doing? And you realize that like 5 or 1% of your requests are taking like a minute instead of 100 milliseconds. So yeah, people like learn tricks like that, and just teaching them two completely separate systems is just blooming annoying. But yeah, I'm sure there are people that get around it. There's an article which I will try and find and put in the show notes about why monitoring in GraphQL is really hard. And I think they start talking about why, some of the ways they've got around it, but I would much rather just use Elastic APM if they've already added support for it. And great, just do that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I didn't even really know Elastic had an APM service out there, so it's kind of cool to know that that's not a thing as well as a competitor to Relic and all that kind of stuff.
It'll be interesting to see how you fare with that. I'm curious what it looks like a month down the road or 2 months down the road once you've started using it. Hopefully your experience is really great with it. I certainly don't know of any competitors that I would recommend, but Elastic tends to make really good stuff, and their documentation is always pretty top notch too.
Yeah, well, that's how I found out that they had it. Like, that's they have a full list of every single framework that they support in GraphQL, and like just beautiful documentation that's really meticulous. I think I didn't know that it existed until I started researching kind of log management solutions, and it's been a while since I've set up login for APIs. And in the past, I think we had log entries at WeWork, and I wasn't very happy with log entries. It's kind of it was just very expensive and kind of a bit weak on features, but. So we were looking at getting on the Elk stack, Elasticsearch and Logstash and Kibana. And yeah, Elastic have a hosted Elk stack you can use. And I was like, oh, that looks pretty cool. And they just so happen to have the APM as well. So we can just like send all of our stuff to Elasticsearch and have this one solution for everything. Hopefully there's good integration between like logs and monitoring and everything else. So yeah, we're gonna start playing with that soon, and hopefully by next episode I can share some findings. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll have to check back in.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear about like how they handle REST and everything too, just because. But so the change topic so fast, Mike, you had some really good questions you wanted to bring up about like Firebase and things like that. And even though I don't think any of us really know much about Firebase, I think it'd be fun to just kind of see what we can come up with. So
yeah,
what are these burning questions?
So I would put myself out there as, between the three of us, the resident Firebase expert. My side projects, a lot of the things I work on that aren't sort of my gig with Gymnasium are very central, using Firebase for pulling data and syncing data and all that by nature. So given that you guys don't really know a ton about it, these questions might not land super well, but I saw Phil posted last night or maybe this morning. I'm not exactly sure when I saw it, but it was something along the lines of, it's really nice to be able to recommend tools for folks when they ask how to build an API now, because the tooling that he's working on, the tooling that he's building, is really helpful to help people set up, for example, build documentation, to edit their API schema, and to do things like run a scaffolded test server. So I'm going to give a quick description of how my experience with Firebase as a database works. But the primary pitch for Firebase for data service is that it is a streaming instant update data storage service. So in other words, if you have some sort of and I should say too, it's non-relational. So it's sort of like a document database. It's stored in Google's cloud somewhere. And essentially the way it works is, you pay attention to an endpoint in your database, meaning, so for a concrete example, let's say I had an address book list. And so Firebase will tell you whenever your address book list is updated, whenever it's deleted, whenever you get an edit to anything in your address book, if you sort of subscribe to listen to it. So it's using WebSockets and all that goodness that we have in some of our tools. What I'm curious about in particular is how you would think about designing an API for something where the platform, the database service, really is not by its nature designed to have a middleware on top of it. So in other words, one of the primary benefits to using Firebase is that I can subscribe to an endpoint in the database, to a target in the database, a list somewhere, and get updates whenever the database updates. But what it would be really nice to do would be able to assign a database schema or an API schema to it to say, like, hey, I really want to validate this for this field, right? Addresses should have a valid zip code that's either Canadian or American, or you shouldn't be able to create this sort of a node without a relation to that sort of a node. Firebase just kind of doesn't have that sort of a thing. And I'm curious if there's anything that you've seen or used or would recommend to someone to be able to structure a database that really needs live updating, but doesn't have, I don't know, doesn't essentially remove that WebSocket functionality from Firebase without, I guess, a really good reason. I don't know. Does that question even make remote sense?
Yeah, I think so. So how are you actually making the requests? Is it a HTTP request or is it something different? WebSockets? Everything's just a WebSocket?
Yeah, it's WebSockets. It's through Firebase or through Google's APIs. So they have like a Ruby one, a JavaScript one, and Java. All of the sort of platforms they have a supported native library for. So you're not setting up something like an HTTP request, but you're using their internal stuff. And I imagine that's sort of what makes it particularly challenging to put middleware on top of.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm looking at the Firebase documentation, and they have got a thing which is like you can use HTTP requests. It's got like there's a Node.js example with Express, and you just kind of make requests as Express. If it's HTTP requests, you can absolutely just use like Open API and JSON schema as normal, and just validate things. A really cool API gateway, actually, back to that topic, is Express Gateway, and it's like a Node.js thing, which kind of like passes your requests through. So you could theoretically be running Express Gateway with JSON schema validation stuff built in, and then it just validates the incoming request before it passes it on. Yeah, that would be one way to wrap it. If it's WebSockets, I have no idea of any sort of tools that do the same sort of thing. Like a WebSocket proxy or something is what you need with middleware support. And I don't know anything about that. Sounds cool though.
Yeah. At some time we should jump on a screen share and I should walk you through like what it looks like. And bear in mind that all of this comes through the lens of my own learning of Firebase as I have through developing these projects. But it seems like their whole infrastructure guides you towards building a database that has like its own validation rules put in their native language. And then a slew of microservices built on Google's equivalent of Lambda functions. So like Google Cloud Functions, I think they're called. And it really like can lend itself to becoming very confusing very quickly. And I've seen a handful of blog posts about like, oh man, like we didn't realize that these two cloud functions were calling each other and updating the same part of the database and triggering each other over and over. And like really trigger some cloud spend in a way that gets out of control, in minutes. It's an interesting section of database logic. And Bill, in particular, when you and I are writing the book, some of the things that like I've left comments about or we've talked about sort of as side conversations really come from my experience building, I would call it almost a pseudo API on top of a database that works like this, where it's a matter of pulling the database inverted from what you would typically think. So your software isn't going and asking the database, hey, what's up? It's the database saying, hey, I got something new. And talking to you in that way. So a lot of the time, my perspective is sort of backwards. And I think really that has to do with me coming at this as a front-end developer who didn't really have to know the back-end stuff to begin with.
Yeah, I got you. That sounds really interesting. I think there's probably something that Async API can be helping out with there. And I'm sure there's some tooling around there. I think a lot of the kind of API stuff I'm working on at the moment is incredibly classically like HTTP request response model. That's about it.
Yeah.
So it's a lot about Open API specifically, and it's a lot about just HTTP request response. And I want to start branching the tooling out and the writing out and everything out as more and more real time stuff, especially in the specification world, starts to happen. So Async API in general, is version 2. I think it's still RC, but it's getting really powerful. And there's a lot of tooling starting to show up. And Prism is at some point going to start doing Async API work. Like right now, it's a mock server that can also handle like proxying with validation on. So in a way, it's becoming just like that Express Gateway functionality. Like Prism, you could run that, and it will give you validation errors if your requests are rubbish, and then it makes them to the upstream thing. There's no reason that sort of stuff can't be done for asynchronous style things as well. So yeah, I'd like to work on that. I just really want to nail like the basic request response. Here's your JSON. Like once that stuff is completely nailed, which honestly I feel like Stoplight is pretty much done now. Like there's no more confusion around trying to glue random crap bits of tooling together that are all out of date and don't really work properly. Like they have something for everything there. It just works and it's great and it's integrated. So like now that that's sorted out, I start branching out into more like asynchronous real-time APIs,
It is pretty magical to see what Stoplight's able to do. It removes, I would say, 99% of my excuses about not doing test-driven development. Because most of the time that has to do with like, but then we'd have to mock an endpoint and deal with the server. And like, well, what do I know about that? And getting rid of that is something that's going to force me to write better software. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah. It's helpful.
I think on the last episode we talked, Studio wasn't totally released yet, but now I know it's general availability.
Yeah.
I've played with it. I love the tool. I think it's great. My boss asked me for it, so I sent it to him even. But how is the team feeling? Like, was it a successful launch? Like, is everyone happy with it? Everyone's kind of calmed down for a little bit before the next big thing, or?
Yeah, it's had amazing feedback. I had like the one tweet is like, here it is, it's finally out, and it got like 600 retweets and likes and stuff. It just blew up, which was really fun. Everyone was a bit confused. I think my Twitter was like 95% of the traffic source, so that was like the whole internet just went, yay, retweet, and clicked on it. Yeah, it's gone really well. Lots of really good feedback. There were a couple of issues. We're on version 1.112. So there was a minor release which added a few more features and fixed a bunch of stuff. And then we've just done a few more incremental bug fixes. A lot of the work at the moment is going on bug stuff, just because we did all sorts of testing with all sorts of repositories. We looked at Mike Ralphson's OpenAPI 3 examples. He's got this repo of like real tricky, like asshole OpenAPI examples, and just like, circular references and awkward things and like malicious stuff that will try and cause memory overflows and just like the worst. We run all of those and we got it all working and we felt good. But then people, when unlimited number of people start doing like random repositories, we completely forgot about the use case where if someone has a repo with like a gigabyte file in it, like some giant video in there, and that completely mucks it up, and a bunch of other things like that. So we've been fixing things like mad. But there's a bunch of people working on fixing all those bugs. So, they come in, they get fixed, we release updates, and we've got auto update on there as well. So if that's enabled and works on your operating system, then it just gets better over time.
Nice.
That's really cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, I sat down and within an hour of opening it up and getting it going, I had an API pretty much scaffold in about the time it took me to drink a cup of coffee, to be honest. Like, just really fast. It was really easy, super intuitive. So to you, to the team, I know some of you guys at Stoplight listen to us rant and rave, but thank you all for your hard work. I know this is going to be a huge tool for the API community. So, again, thank you guys for that one. So, I mean, what is next at Stoplight then, Phil?
So I'm working on the hosted mocking solution right now. So right now, for people that want to kind of share their mock server with somebody, you can kind of, if you both have Studio installed, then you just kind of git pull, and then you get the updates, and you click mock server, and you run it locally. So we want to have the hosted mock server up. That should hopefully not take too long. And what else are we working on? Mostly log management. That's not very exciting. No one cares about that. There's something we just fixed up actually is custom rule sets. So rule sets for a while were a little bit funky. Rule sets are basically in Spectral. Think of them as like a style guide. Like your company can have a style guide where you say, we want all of our URLs to have, to be plural if they're a collection, and everything should be in the JSON response should be camel case instead of underscores for whatever reason, and like all these different types of thing. Like all operations should have a description so people know what the heck they're doing. All of that sort of stuff is stuff that you can write yourself. And that's really what Spectral was about. I think a few people thought it was a validator that was a tad opinionated, but really it's about style guides for your company, for all of your APIs. And they were a bit limited before. You couldn't make custom functions. So if like Spectral didn't supply the thing out of the box, like there was no way to check for plurals. So like now you can just write your own stuff, and eventually we'll keep on growing the style guide functions and powers, and it's just a nice simple little YAML file. And then if you want to reference some JavaScript functions, you just reference those, and it's TypeScript. But yeah, works real good.
Nice. I saw a tweet the other day. Stoplight also has hosted documentation, right?
Yeah, free hosted documentation.
Which I kind of think was like one of the highlights of the Specky tool you wrote, which was really quickly able to generate redoc and then throw it on GitHub pages or Netlify, whatever you want to. So knowing that now Stoplight does that as well, I think is a huge win and will help even more people. So maybe we can burn Specky to the ground.
Yeah, there's not really much reason to keep Specky around. I mean, the team over at WeWork are well, there's not like a team working on it. The very nice two people that agreed to kind of keep merging pull requests, they don't have a huge amount of time to work on it. So it's pretty much unmaintained. I think bugs get fixed now and then, but there's no huge development work being done. Meanwhile, we've got like multiple people crushing out, knocking out huge, awesome features on a regular basis. So the one thing that Specky does still is that it will convert like it converts proper JSON schema to like open API flavored schema objects, which this doesn't do yet. Spectral doesn't do that. It's just like you have to write proper open API. Sorry. So that's one thing I'd like to solve. But seeing as we have plug and play resolvers, you theoretically someone could just write a different resolver that's it replaces the standard HTTP and file loading resolver with one that also converts JSON schema, and then there's no reason to keep it around. Yeah. Like the Stoplight doc stuff is so awesome because you don't have to figure out what tool you're going to use to generate the documentation and like where you're going to host it and how to hook that up on CI and all this other stuff. It just does it. You can in Studio you can click publish and it will just go straight up there. You'd have to do anything. It's already hosted on a URL. We're adding the ability to have paid custom domains and stuff like that soon, but it's just the like free hosted one for now. So you can do that, or we'll give you a command that you can run in your CI/CD that will just kind of update for you, right? And copying and pasting one command versus like trying to work out how to deploy to S3 or whatever else, like it's completely different. And the fact that a lot of the tools like Redoc and it's just that there's nothing good. I mean, Swaggy UI, if anyone still uses that, those tools only do API reference documentation. So you can't have like markdown files with other giant guides and information in there, which Stoplight Studio supports as well. So yeah, you can hook it up, like whatever your workflow is, wherever your Git stored, whatever you're doing, you can just use this thing and it's free and you don't have to figure out any of that crap.
Nice. So that answers my other question, which was, is the Stoplight stuff like a homegrown solution, or is it like Redoc that y'all just kind of did? But it sounds like Stoplight kind of wrote their own to kind of handle, again, markdown files and other information that's not API specific for front-end developers, back-end developers, whoever's.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah, we are against kind of using Open API specific tooling because it's not going to be just Open API. We also support like JSON schema standalone proper models. So if you don't have any Open API in your company, but you do have JSON schema models, you can still use that. And Async API is going to be added soon and everything else. So we've really kind of abstracted a lot of stuff away, which means that we can add more stuff in the future. Like if RAML gets important, no one seems to want RAML. I tweeted out and I was like, it was just like, if I was to add support for RAML, would you want version 8? 0.08, version 1, or you don't care at all? And it was like 90% of people don't care at all. I was like, oh, all right, I guess RAML's not really a thing anymore. But API Blueprint might be making a comeback. I was chatting to those folks, and that might be a thing. So we could add support for API Blueprint theoretically, and stuff like that. Yeah.
Nice, cool. So last really burning question is how is the trees coming along, and when might we see everyone back on a bike?
That's a good question. It looks like you guys were having fun riding bikes together. I didn't realize you were in the same place.
Yeah,
I am not.
I had a weight loss challenge thrown my way, and part of it was riding a metric century, which is 62 miles or 100 kilometers. And the goal was under 3.5 hours, so 18, 19-ish mile per hour pace. And I was just talking to Mike about it one day, just kind of through Slack, just kind of ranting. I was like, I'm not getting any faster. This is terrible. And he's like, I'm going to come on over and do it with you. And I was like, okay, yeah, cool. So he drove up the night before we both went. It was about 45 minutes north of where I live, right on the border of Tennessee and Kentucky. And we stayed together for a good while, didn't we? Till about the 30-mile mark is when I kind of took off, I think.
Yeah, that's when it all came unhinged for me. I learned a few important lessons that weekend. One in particular is a 7 or 8 hour drive the night before a long bike ride is really havoc on the legs.
That sounds terrible, yeah.
Yeah, I felt like my legs were 1,000 pounds each that day. And then also, like, food that you eat on the side of the highway in the U.S. is probably not the best fuel for a pre-ride adventure.
Just Dunkin' Donuts the whole way, right?
Oh man, I was in miserable
Arby's.
shape. I'm proud to say that Matt rode circles around me that day. You took off like a rocket, man. You're really taking care of business. And I had a lot of fun. Like, it was a beautiful route. I'd love to do it again next year. But it was definitely a very taxing day on me. By the end of it, like, we rode, I think, from 7 in the morning to like 11 or 12 or something like that. And afterwards, we had like plans to go grab hot chicken because that's the Nashville thing to eat. And like,
Of course.
my stomach was in ruins. Like, I told Matt, I was like, I don't even think I can have a drink right now. And so we went to a burger
I just
king down
ate
the street.
fire.
Yeah, that's it, man. I had like a big Coke and then like 2 or 3 French fries, and I was like, nah, man, I can't eat. I'm sorry.
Ugh,
And then I hopped on the road and drove another 8 hours back home, which, again, probably not the best idea for my legs. But.
Nice. Yeah, well, my legs are messed up. I injured my Achilles tendon. It's not snapped, but it is very strained, and it feels like there's polystyrene crunching around in there sometimes. I rested it for like a week, and then I was like, I'm fine, and jumped back on the bike, and 2 days later, not fine. So I rested it for 2 weeks and then jumped back on the bike, and I went to cyclocross practice here in New York, and I was just whipping it around the park, just going mad, jumping on and off the bike, all that stuff, and jumping over barriers. And then, my foot was not fine. So I keep resting it for like hardly any time and then getting back to it. And I need to like properly rest it for like 6 to 8 weeks, which is absolutely devastating, but it means I'm getting time to work on other projects. So I'm working on Awesome Earth. I've got a GitHub repo where I'm collecting all of the, like, here's something you can do to make the planet better, like Offset Earth, which I talked about, and a bunch of other ones like switch energy suppliers. Here's a subscription service for like cleaning supplies that don't have plastic, all this stuff, right? So I'm working on those. I'm working on the book, and I'm getting things done. So I'm not that upset now that I've realized I'll have 6 weeks to work on things. But it does mean that I'm like limping around and can't walk for 20 minutes without being in pain. And I just have to like ice all the time. So
Are you in New York now for the next 6 to 8 weeks, or?
I've got a bunch of conferences coming up, so I'm having to like try even harder to save the planet to offset the flights. The flights were so stupid. I didn't think this through. I submitted to 4 API conferences, and got accepted to 3 of them. And I wasn't expecting that. But I was in Amsterdam just anyway, because it's where my friend lives, and then went to the first conference in Seattle. Now I have to go back to Amsterdam for the next conference, and then back to Vancouver. It's the dumbest thing. They're right next to each other. Seattle and Vancouver are like a short bus trip away. So if I could have cancelled any one of those, then I wouldn't have had to like bounce across the earth. But I'm doing like 9,000 miles for pretty much no reason. Or even more than that. So not great, but I am going to be at pretty much every single API conference this year. I just missed API Days in Barcelona. My friend Vincenzo did a great job there. But yes, I'm going to be at API The Docs in Amsterdam, and I'll see you at API Specification Conference in October as well.
The specification one, that's a new one, right? That, like, they just spun that one up, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a rename. I think there was a different conference, and now it's that.
Was it API Strat initially?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, they needed a new name, and I think they came up with one that was awesome, but then somebody else took it, and so now they just have this name, which is a bit weird. Like, API The Docs and API Specifications are 2 very niche things. So I hope that they do well, right? Like,
yeah,
I hope that there are a lot of people that are like, oh, API documentation, woo, I can't wait to go to that. I really hope there are. They seem very specific, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. Not being to either.
Yeah, no, I mean, it'll be cool. I'm curious to hear about them. Real quick, how was API City? How was that one? Yeah,
it was a really good conference. It was a 1-day track, 1 day, 1 track. The talks were 20 minutes. So this happened to me last year. I had like a 40-minute talk just smushed into 20 minutes. So this time I was like really, really fast trying to get through it all. And I finished my talk in like 16 minutes. But it means that you get a lot of different content throughout the day. You go to a conference and you get like, 40 speakers that you can listen to, because everyone just goes through on these really short 20-minute talks. Probably not actually 40, but whatever, math. Yeah, great conference. Happy to go to that again next year if it's all possible, and the year before. So
nice.
Yeah.
So Amsterdam is next for you, right?
Yes, API The Docs is the one.
Mike, where's the next chance someone might catch you in the wild?
Yeah, so actually tomorrow night, as we're recording this, which is going to be way too late by the time you hear this, but I'm going to be up at Jamstack meetup in Boston. So there's a Jamstack meetup that they have in Boston next week. I'm going to be at the Jamstack meetup in Philadelphia, which would be September the 23rd, maybe 24th. It's a Wednesday night. So Boston this week, Philadelphia next week, and then I'm going to Artifact Conference in Austin, Texas, the week after that. So I'm bouncing around quite a few things over the next few weeks. Yeah, that's gonna keep me busy for a while, and then after that, hopefully nothing planned. What about you, Matt?
I will be, by the time this episode is put out to the masses, it'll be too late, but I'll be at Cascadia PHP this weekend keynoting. I'm the closing keynoter, so that's kind of weird that I get that honor, but it's super cool. And then I have yet to submit to a single conference next year. I'm probably just going to take it easy and work on getting in shape for the crit season, because I'm going to attempt to be a crit racer. So I might die.
Man. That's going to be a lot of fun. Yeah, you're gonna be Crashy McCiderface. You can take the name.
Yeah, we'll see. But guys, it was great talking to you guys as always. I look forward to the next time we catch up. As you know, Phil is at Phil Surgeon, Mike is at Irreverent Mike, and I'm at Matthew Trask. And we will catch you all next time. Thanks, guys.
Take it easy, guys.